If you had driven past that brand new pharmacy the week before it opened, you'd have seen a beautiful $8 million building with fresh brick walls, spotless windows, shiny landscaping, and a drive-through lane wrapping neatly around the side like it had always belonged there. What you wouldn't have noticed was that the entire project depended on 15 feet of land they didn't actually control, and those 15 feet belonged to me. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 63 years old, and for almost 3 decades I've owned a little drive-through coffee stand called Morning Oak Coffee just outside Plano, Texas. It's nothing fancy. We don't have touchscreen ordering boards or corporate loyalty apps. We know our regulars by name. We remember who likes extra cinnamon in their latte. And most mornings I can tell who's pulling into the lot just by the sound of their pickup truck before I even look outside. I always figured that was enough. I never wanted to be rich. I just wanted to own something honest that nobody could take away from me. Funny enough, that little dream almost disappeared because of one document I signed 26 years earlier, and it was eventually saved by the exact same document. Back in 2000, the property next to mine belonged to a husband and wife pharmacy, Bill and Margaret Lawson. Sweet people. They had one delivery van, 2 pharmacists, and a tiny storefront that looked more like an old country clinic than a business. We weren't close friends, but we watched each other's places whenever one of us went on vacation. If someone suspicious walked around their building after hours, I'd call Bill. If my freezer compressor made a strange noise while I was away, he'd stop by to check it. That's just how neighbors treated each other back then. One afternoon, Bill walked over carrying a folder under his arm. He looked almost embarrassed. "Evelyn," he said, "our delivery trucks have gotten bigger, and it's getting tight pulling around the building. Any chance you'd let us use a strip along your property line?" I asked how much land he needed. 15 feet. I laughed and said, "Bill, if that's all you need, why are you acting like you're asking for my firstborn?" We hired a local attorney, drew up an easement, and signed everything properly. There was one sentence the lawyer insisted on including: the easement could be revoked at the property owner's discretion with proper notice. Bill looked at me and smiled. "We'll probably never need to worry about that." I smiled back. "Probably not." Life moved on. Years rolled by faster than I expected. Margaret retired. Bill eventually passed away. Their children sold the business, and I honestly didn't think much about it. Businesses change hands all the time. Coffee still needed to be brewed every morning. Then one Tuesday I opened my mailbox and found a glossy envelope with a corporate logo I'd never seen before. Inside was a beautifully designed letter full of words like strategic expansion, customer optimization, regional investment, and enhanced healthcare experience. It was signed by someone named Nathan Holloway, Vice President of Real Estate Development for Metastar Pharmacy Group. They had purchased the property next door and planned to replace the old pharmacy with a flagship location. They called it a courtesy notification. I noticed something interesting. The letter thanked neighboring businesses for their cooperation during construction, but nowhere did it mention my easement, not once. I figured maybe they'd bring it up later. Corporate people liked meetings. Surely someone would call. Nobody did. A few weeks later, demolition crews arrived before sunrise. Within days, the old pharmacy I'd looked at for 25 years was gone. Giant excavators moved in. Concrete trucks rolled through every afternoon. Steel beams reached into the sky. Customers at my coffee shop stood outside watching the progress like it was free entertainment. I wasn't bothered. Honestly, I hoped the new pharmacy would bring me more business. More traffic usually meant more coffee sales. Everybody wins. At least that's what I believed. About 5 months into construction, I noticed something strange while walking my property after closing one evening. The new drive-through lane curved much farther toward my lot than I remembered. At first I assumed it was just an optical illusion caused by fresh pavement. The next morning, I brought out the old survey markers I'd kept in my office for years. The measurements didn't lie. Their lane wasn't simply close to my easement. It depended on it. Every single customer entering the drive-through would cross those 15 feet before reaching the pharmacy window. That little strip wasn't just convenient. It was essential. I drove down to the county records office that afternoon and requested every publicly available site plan, engineering drawing, traffic study, and recorded plat connected to the project. The clerk raised an eyebrow and joked, "Planning to build your own pharmacy?" I smiled and said, "No, just trying to understand my new neighbors." 3 hours later, I was sitting in my truck flipping through rolled-up engineering plans spread across the passenger seat. The deeper I looked, the quieter I became. Every traffic calculation, every projected customer count, every turning radius, Every emergency vehicle clearance, every single one assumed permanent access across my land. They hadn't designed around my easement. They had designed their entire $8 million investment as if they already owned those 15 feet forever. I leaned back in my seat, looked across the parking lot at the rising building catching the evening sunlight, and for the first time since construction began, one thought settled into my mind that refused to leave. They never asked because they never imagined I'd have the right to say no. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was angry, and honestly not even because I was excited. It was something stranger than that. I kept replaying the same question over and over in my head. How does a company with billions behind it spend months planning a project without confirming whether they actually controlled the land their entire traffic system depended on? I must have read those documents 5 times before sunrise, hoping I'd missed an amendment somewhere, a revised filing, maybe even a second easement I didn't know existed. There wasn't one. The original agreement from 2000 was still exactly what I'd remembered, almost word for word. Temporary, revocable, my property. The following morning, I called the number on the glossy letter. After bouncing through 3 departments, I finally reached Nathan Holloway. His voice sounded polished, practiced, the kind of voice that smiled even when the person behind it didn't. "Ms. Carter," he said cheerfully, "what can I help you with?" I told him I'd reviewed the construction plans and wanted to discuss the easement before the project was completed. There was a brief pause before he answered, "I'm not sure what there is to discuss. Our legal department already confirmed access." I looked at the old document sitting beside me on the counter. Access, yes. Ownership, no. Another pause. The easement is permanent. Actually, I replied calmly, you might want to read paragraph 4 again. I heard papers moving on his end, then silence. Not awkward silence. Expensive silence. The kind that happens when somebody realizes an assumption just turned into a liability. Nearly 15 seconds passed before he finally spoke again. "Would you mind emailing me a copy?" "Of course," I said, "although I suspect your attorneys already have one." We ended the call politely, but something had changed. For months, they'd been speaking to me like a neighboring business owner. That afternoon, they started speaking to me like a variable in a financial equation. By the next morning, I had 3 emails waiting. One requested a meeting. Another asked whether I'd consider clarifying certain historical ambiguities. The third came from outside counsel introducing themselves and offering to resolve any misunderstandings collaboratively. Funny thing about lawyers, the friendlier their first email sounds, the more expensive the problem usually is. I still wasn't looking for a fight. People imagine these situations like some movie where the little business owner immediately starts plotting revenge. That wasn't me. I wanted certainty. That's all. So, before I responded to anyone, I hired my own land use attorney, Susan Mercer. Susan had silver hair, wire-frame glasses, and the irritating habit of reading every document 3 times before saying a single word. After nearly an hour, she leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said, "they've created one spectacular mess." I asked if I was missing something. She smiled. "No, Evelyn, they are." She explained exactly what I'd already suspected. The easement had never transferred into permanent access rights. It remained entirely dependent on the grantor, me. "Can they force me to continue?" I asked. Susan shook her head. "Not unless a court rewrites history, and judges generally dislike doing that." "Can they redesign?" "Sure," she replied, "if they enjoy spending another year rebuilding half their site." I stared out her office window for a long moment. "I'm not trying to bankrupt anybody." Susan laughed softly. "Good, because you don't have to. You simply need to decide what your property is actually worth." That sentence stayed with me. Property isn't just dirt. Sometimes it's leverage. Sometimes it's timing. Sometimes 15 feet becomes the most valuable real estate in an $8 million project. Over the next week, I watched construction differently. Workers installed landscaping. Electricians wired the drive-through menu boards. Painters finished the exterior. Every afternoon, cars from corporate headquarters came and went. Everyone looked busy. Everyone looked confident. None of them looked toward my coffee stand. It was as though I'd become invisible. Until I wasn't. Susan suggested one more step before making any decisions. Document everything. So I did. I photographed the lane from every angle. I recorded traffic patterns. I hired an independent surveyor who placed fresh markers along my boundary. Watching him hammer bright orange stakes into the ground was oddly satisfying. A few construction supervisors wandered over almost immediately. "What's all this?" one of them asked. "Boundary confirmation," I answered. Shouldn't affect your work, unless you're building where you shouldn't. They exchanged nervous looks and walked away without another word. 2 days later, Nathan called again. His voice had lost its easy confidence. Could we meet in person? He asked. I'd prefer to understand your concerns. We met inside my coffee shop before opening hours. He showed up wearing an expensive navy suit that looked completely out of place next to the smell of fresh muffins and espresso. I poured him a black coffee. He barely touched it. Instead, he opened a leather portfolio filled with spreadsheets, revenue forecasts, customer projections, demographic studies, page after page of numbers. This location, he explained, is expected to serve approximately 240 vehicles per day through the drive-thru. He slid the papers toward me like they were supposed to impress me. I glanced at them politely before sliding them back. Nathan, I said, those are wonderful numbers, but they're all based on land you don't own. His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. Surely we can find a reasonable solution. I agree, I replied. That's exactly why I asked you here. I handed him my proposal. He read the first page, then the second. Then he stopped halfway through the third and looked at me as though I'd suddenly started speaking another language. 15-year irrevocable agreement? He asked. Yes. Monthly compensation? Yes. Repaving your access road? Correct. Property maintenance contribution? Yes. His eyebrows climbed even higher. This totals well over $1 million. Over 15 years, I corrected. He leaned back in his chair and gave a short laugh that didn't contain any humor. You realize this sounds like robbery. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering. No, Nathan. Robbery's taking something that belongs to someone else without permission. This is called negotiating. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Customers began lining up outside the drive-thru. One of my employees unlocked the front door. Pretending not to notice the tension sitting in booth number 3, Nathan gathered his papers. Our board won't approve this. Maybe not, I said. Then I suppose you'll need a new traffic design. He stood up. Do you have any idea what that would cost? Probably less than assuming small businesses don't read contracts. He walked out without finishing his coffee. 3 days later, the phone calls became less friendly. Their attorneys accused me of acting in bad faith. One consultant suggested I was exploiting a technicality. Another implied the public opinion might turn against my business if local residents learned I was delaying a pharmacy. I listened carefully to every argument. Then I asked the same question every single time. Which clause of the easement requires me to continue? Nobody ever answered that question directly. They talked about fairness, community benefit, corporate investment, economic impact. They talked about everything except the contract they had inherited when they bought the property. Meanwhile, construction stopped making progress around the drive-thru entrance. Workers continued inside the building, but outside, everyone seemed hesitant. It looked almost like watching people decorate a house whose front door might disappear tomorrow. About 2 weeks later, Susan called me with a smile in her voice. Well, she said, I think reality has finally reached their boardroom. Meaning? I asked. Meaning someone finally calculated what happens if they lose those 15 feet. I laughed quietly. And? Apparently, she replied, it's considerably more expensive than your proposal. 2 mornings later, Nathan's assistant called requesting another meeting. This time, they weren't coming to convince me. They were coming to negotiate. When Nathan walked back into my coffee shop the second time, he looked like a completely different man. The expensive suit was still there. The polished shoes were still shining. But the confidence he'd worn during our first meeting had disappeared somewhere between corporate headquarters and my little drive-thru. This time, he wasn't carrying colorful revenue projections or glossy marketing folders, just a thin stack of legal papers and a notebook with handwritten notes filling almost every page. Before either of us sat down, he looked around the shop for a moment. My morning regulars were laughing with my employees. Someone was picking up a dozen breakfast tacos for an office meeting, and an older couple I'd known for nearly 20 years waved as they left with 2 cups of coffee. Nathan watched all of it quietly before saying something I honestly hadn't expected. You've built something special here. I smiled. It took 28 years. He nodded slowly. Our company tried to build something similar in 18 months. Neither of us mentioned the obvious difference. Mine had been built one customer at a time. Theirs had been built one spreadsheet at a time. He slid the revised agreement across the table. Every major financial term was there. 15 years, monthly payments, complete resurfacing of my access road, ongoing maintenance responsibilities. Their board had approved everything. I carefully turned each page without rushing. Susan had taught me years ago that people often reveal themselves while you're reading. Sure enough, Nathan couldn't hide his impatience. His fingers tapped lightly against the table as he waited. Then I reached the final page and quietly smiled. "There's one more condition," I said. He frowned. "I thought we'd already settled everything." "Almost." I handed him a single-page amendment. He scanned it in less than 20 seconds. "Traffic exceeding 240 vehicles per day will incur an additional $2 access fee per vehicle. Any damage to my property resulting from excessive traffic or maintenance failures immediately suspends access until repairs are completed, plus a contractual penalty." He looked back at me. "Seriously?" "Very. You're expecting us to become too successful? I'm expecting your own projections to be accurate." He stared at the page for another long moment before laughing. An actual laugh this time. Tired, defeated, but genuine. "You know," he said, "our traffic consultants predicted almost exactly that number. I read the same report." He shook his head. "I guess you did." A week later, the contracts were signed. Construction crews removed the temporary fencing, finished the landscaping around the entrance, and the grand opening went ahead exactly 3 weeks later than planned. Local officials cut ribbons. Cameras flashed. Giant banners promised the fastest pharmacy drive-through in North Texas. Customers lined up around the block. I watched from across the street with a cup of coffee in my hand, not feeling victorious, just thoughtful. Success isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's simply about refusing to give away something valuable because someone else assumed they were entitled to it. By the end of the first week, Susan called me laughing before I even answered the phone. "Well," she said, "your accountants are going to be busy." Their average traffic had reached 267 vehicles per day, 27 above the agreed threshold, every single day. $2 per vehicle didn't sound like much until thousands of cars rolled through month after month. Even funnier, a few weeks later, one of my regular customers happened to work as an assistant manager at the pharmacy. He leaned across my drive-through window one morning and whispered, "Corporate actually tracks the vehicle counter now." "Really?" I asked, pretending to be surprised. He laughed. "Around 4 o'clock every afternoon, if we're getting close to 2:40, management starts encouraging people to use the walk-in counter instead." I couldn't help laughing too. Imagine spending millions creating the fastest drive-through in the region, only to slow customers down because 15 feet of land you never owned had become one of the most expensive pieces of pavement in your entire operation. Every month since then, a payment arrives like clockwork. No arguments, no threatening letters, no emergency meetings. Just another transfer approved by the same accounting department that once believed my property was little more than a technical detail. Nathan and I still see each other occasionally. He's actually become surprisingly friendly. Last Christmas, he even stopped by for coffee and admitted something that stuck with me. He said, "Our biggest mistake wasn't the easement. It was believing small businesses don't understand the value of what they own." I told him he was only half right. "Your biggest mistake," I said, "was assuming we'd trade respect for convenience." He smiled, shook my hand, and drove away. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I feel guilty charging a large corporation that much money. My answer is always the same. They weren't paying me because they were big. They were paying because they built an $8 million investment on an assumption instead of a signed agreement. There's a difference. A very expensive difference. Every morning I still unlock morning oat coffee before sunrise. I still know most of my customers by name. The pharmacy next door is busy almost every day, and every car that carefully rounds that familiar curve reminds me of something my father used to say when I was a little girl. Never underestimate a piece of land just because it looks small. Sometimes the smallest corner holds the entire foundation together. I didn't stop their project. I didn't ruin their business. I simply reminded them that ownership still matters, contracts still matter, and respect matters even more. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have revoked the easement completely, accepted their first offer, or negotiated exactly the way I did? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you've ever seen a giant company underestimate an ordinary person, I'd love to hear that story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.